Good afternoon. To get us excited for the second half of the day, we're going to do a very brief slow clap so that everyone outside knows that it's time to be in. So let's do that and then we'll get going. That was also a test to make sure that all of you were awake, so you have passed. I hope you were able to enjoy your lunch and able to enjoy the branding session if you attended that or connect with employers. And most importantly, hope you were able to connect with new people and have great conversations. We are going to continue this afternoon with some remarkable speakers. And in a moment, I'm going to welcome our next speaker in conversation. His name is Igboje Ig Imokwede. He is the chairman of the African Initiative for Governance and also the chairman of Coronation Capital. He is going to be in conversation with our very own Dean Peter Tufano here at the Said Business School. And so it is my pleasure to welcome them to the stage.
Thank you. Okay, so welcome back. I hope you've enjoyed the morning. I hope you've enjoyed lunch. If you went to the session on media, that was great. And if you're still outside talking to employers, I suppose you're not in the room. So that's great. As you've already heard, our guest today, Imokwede, no, that's not quite right. Ig is fine. Is the founder and chairman of the Africa Initiative for Governance, which also has the same initials as his name, which is very convenient. A nonprofit institution established as a catalyst for high public sector performance in Africa. As you also heard, or at least if you listened carefully from one of the questioners, he's a supporter of the Blavatnik School. He's on the advisory board of the Blavatnik School and supports students there. He's the founder and chairman of Coronation Capital, which we're going to hear more about, which is an African-focused private equity and proprietary investment firm. Prior to that, he was the group managing director and CEO of Axis Bank. He's a commander of the Order of Nigeria. He's won many awards, including the E&Y Entrepreneur of the Year. He is on many boards. He's a force of nature in his country and beyond. And so today's, I think, and we'll use the same rules as before. I'll go for about 20, 25 minutes, and then it's over to you for your questions. And today, let's think about this as a play in 3 acts, or at least 3 acts so far. And the first act is really the Access Capital Act. And you and I talked in advance about how it is that you created this firm and maybe telling a little bit of the story of that firm, if you could.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Am I mic'd? Okay, fine. Thanks, Dean Tufano. And I think I'll echo the remarks of all speakers with respect to the forum. Great turnout, great energy in the room. But more specifically for me, Africa is home. Africa is my world. And Africa represents the world's greatest opportunity for change and impact. And so when I see institutions and individuals doing the right thing towards catalyzing resources and thought for Africa, I support it. So well done.
Thank you.
Now, people describe me as a banker, some as an entrepreneur. You said force of nature.
Whatever you like.
But you know, it's interesting that I think that the history of individuals has a profound effect on what they become. The reality of growing up and your circumstances influences you in one way or the other. So as I've said, I'm an African. I was born in Nigeria. I went to school in Nigeria, all my school. I studied law. And at the time that, of my birth and schooling, we were trained as Africans, or as Nigerians, actually, because there's a Nigerian way of thought, that the Nigerian could be as productive, as effective, and as important as any individual from any other part of the world in any chosen field of endeavor. And there is a lot of evidence of that. I was born to civil servants as parents. I grew up as a child of a civil servant. And indeed, actually, growing up, and I think Hakeem alluded to it, the best in Nigeria went to the civil service. As a child, that is what I understood about the talent pool that was Nigeria, the best. It was very similar to what you found in Europe at the time. And for reasons best known to the military, with the military's incursion, they decided to, in a sense, stop investing in the civil service, in the public service. And for people like me, I saw the effect on great men and women who'd done great things, and this almost decimation of their relevance and their importance and their contributions to nation building. And I said I wasn't going to work for government. And immediately I started thinking, okay, what do I do? And I'm talking about, I was in primary school at the time I made this decision. What do I do? And then the notion of, okay, fine, let's look at the private sector, what happens in the private sector. I said, okay, fine, I'll lead a multinational. And that's what led me to study law. So the multinationals that were doing well in Nigeria at the time were either oil companies or fast-moving commercial good companies, and most of them picked lawyers if it was the manufacturing or industrial companies as their CEOs. So I decided, okay, law is a good thing to use to get into this hallowed boardrooms. Left school quite early, went to law school. And whilst I was in law school, I had friends who'd gone into banking. And they told me about what it was like to work in a multinational merchant bank in Nigeria at the time. And I decided, okay, fine, you know what, let me make a switch. Let me try banking, or at least for Youth Corps. Youth Corps is this compulsory one-year period of work you do after you graduate. So I got into what was Chase, and then my life changed. And this is the important thing about talent. Very quickly, Youth Corpers were not meant to do the kind of things that I found myself doing in Chase. So obviously, there's some talent spotting mechanism, and all of a sudden, you know, a Youth Corper is in the boardroom, a Youth Corper is in deals. And from that point in time, my life, until I went entrepreneurial, my life has been one where people look at my talent and basically put me at things, okay? So after Youth Corps, I was doing things at the age of 22 that most people did when they were 35, 40, okay? And because of that, no employer would allow me to go back for graduate school, okay? Just simple, it wasn't on the cards. You could go for training as long as, as long as it wasn't longer than, 1 month, okay? And so I didn't have the opportunity to sit in a classroom like this and hone and improve my skills in a certain way, okay? But certainly my talent and my capital was developed, okay? And it was particularly honed in the context of a bank called GTB, Guarantee Trust Bank. And to put things into perspective, that was a startup organization. I joined it as a startup pioneer staff, as a banker, and the bank has gone from what was then maybe $2 million, no less than $1 million of value today to about $3 billion of value. But this is over a 28-year period. And very much so, I was part of the team that built the bank, okay? And so then it gets into this, business school type of point in my life. So I was 32 or 30. You can argue what position I was in that bank, but understand that I was top 4. Let's put it that way. Already this was viewed as the best bank in Nigeria, if not the best bank in sub-Saharan Africa. But I was very unhappy, extremely unhappy, and I didn't know why. And I remember telling my mom that, look, listen, I'm really unhappy. And her response was, you're mad. You're completely mad. There's something wrong with you, So anyway, I went to, so they allowed me to go for 3 months to Harvard for an exec program. At the time, my brother-in-law, who has passed away now, had just finished his MBA and was organizing a conference just like this. And I happened to be in the campus at the time this conference was organized, and this kid looked at me and, he'd been talking to me and kind of understood where I was. And he gave me a book. The book is titled Buyout, written by Rick Rickerson, who had, an MBA from Harvard. And the book changed my life. Okay? So this notion of history defining you and so on. And basically, the book speaks to two types of entrepreneurs. There are two types of entrepreneurs, two types of people in this room. There are people who will do great things as part of teams in salaried employment. And there are people who will do great things as owner-managers or owners of teams, so to speak, or businesses where there are teams in them. So you are going to find yourself in either of those two journey paths. And it might be for profit, it might not be for not for profit, doesn't matter, okay? And I don't think there's any bragging rights either way. It's just for you to find your own self. So for me, I wanted to be an owner. And I resolved there and then when I read the book in 2 hours. And I read it again, and I read it again, and I read it 4 times straight, back to back. And so I said, I'm coming back to Nigeria, I'm going to buy my own bank. Okay? So I was...
You were 32?
32 at the time. And... and I said to myself, again, this, like I said, your history kind of defines you. So I'd worked in Guarantee Trust Bank, and I'd seen a tag team of two owner managers. I knew the power of it. But what was more important to me was that this bank was the beginning of something. It wasn't the end. So I was going to buy my own bank, but it wasn't about building my life around that bank. And so I said I wanted a partner, and I needed to search for the right partner. A partner who would, together with me and a larger team, basically change the way the financial services industry in Africa worked. That's what it was about. And that we would start with this bank, and it would go on and on. And I also felt that, look, I could die, and this wasn't about me. This was about this dream and this vision, and I wanted it to continue irrespective of what happened to me. Again, that notion of sustainability runs through everything that I do. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we started trying to buy banks. Of course, we are trying to buy banks like Guarantee Trust Bank. Well, it was the best, but maybe banks just one rung below. Mm-hmm. And we found that it was kind of a bridge too far. It was either too expensive or, and so on. So we just couldn't, We were both worth $2 million, $2.5 million. So we went to the opposite side of the ranking spectrum and said, bottom of the barrel. And the funny thing is the bank we bought was even below the rung that we were looking at. And it was called Access Bank. And the best way for me to describe the bank was that our $2 million plus $8 million of leverage bought us 52% of the bank. The bank had a foreign currency balance sheet that was less than, at the time, Aliko Dangote's credit card limit. Now, we bought the bank in 2002. Let me fast forward to now. I left the bank, running the bank in 2013. Okay, so we're still the shapers and the influencers from an ownership standpoint of the bank. Herbert runs the bank, and I think and we've grown in organic and inorganic fashion. Okay, so with the last deal we're just closing, the bank would rank in Africa as the largest bank in terms of customers in Africa. It would have about $20 billion odd in assets, maybe $2 billion or thereabouts in capital. So we haven't done badly in terms of operating that story.
Not bad, as we say in Britain, yes. Okay.
And then so that's Access Bank.
Okay, before we leave Access Bank,
okay.
How do you turn a bottom performer into the bank that Access Bank has become? Now, I know that's a long story, but just what are the elements that turned it from kind of, we also sometimes talk about, a silk purse and a sow's ear. You did that. So how did you do it? Okay,
first of all, it's about talent, and you can have the right strategy, you can have the right resources, you can have the right everything. If you don't have the right talent, forget it. Okay? And by the way, you can have the right talent and nothing, okay, and every other thing will fall into place. So it's about the talent, okay? Fortunately, this was an area where we had both domain expertise and, local knowledge, okay? So the good thing about that story is that we were part of building GTB for 10 years. Okay? So it was a combination of, so we said to ourselves, what is the Access Bank person, okay? And we said it wasn't a GT person because we wanted to grow and grow faster than GT, okay? It had to be a mix of a GT person, a Citibank person, because our back office, we felt that the Citibank back office was the gold standard. And then we wanted a mixture of, because business, the value proposition to customers was almost a consulting type of approach to banking. So we also wanted to be a top 4, McKinsey, Bain type of. So imagine creating a talent pool that represented all of this, which is what we did, actually. And very, very testing process, but very, very interesting, bonding, all the things that you go through in building a team. But probably what is great is that those people, the access person, can be set to any task you can think of within or related to that area of domain expertise, and they will excel in it anywhere in the world. So Access UK, for example, because we started a bank in the UK 10 years ago, is the most successful challenger bank in the UK.
So there seems to be a formula here. Access equals GTB plus Citi plus McKinsey. And the next one is going to be even more audacious, which is BlackRock plus Prudential. Why don't you explain the next equation? Because it's, if you want exciting, the next stage is even more so.
Okay, so the issue was like, this was never a story about a bank. This is a story about really, really changing the way financial services operates across Africa. And the one thing, in the room, I came in at 11, so I'm not sure whether this discussion was very heavy earlier on. But the one thing that is not done enough of in Africa is understanding the customer and understanding the pain that customers feel and providing solutions to that pain, whether from a private sector perspective or from a government perspective. Okay? And I think that is what is going to trigger the, this whole notion of Africa's potential and realizing that potential. Okay? So at the short end, okay, of life, if you look at, let me start from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay? If you look at the development of the human being, all right, and what Maslow told us, he says, look, at the very base level, a human being is, needs some very basic things around shelter, and until those things are satisfied, forget it. The human being's thought process doesn't go beyond that. Okay? So when you talk about, for example, you want to change Africa, you want people to vote based on philosophy or whatever it is, the person hasn't eaten. So, so you get my point. Right. Okay? Yeah. So what is clear to me, all right, is that for Africa to pop, all right, for Africa to pop, for the private sector, for the world to truly enjoy Africa, we've got to lift the human beings. Okay? So when you look at this 1.2 billion and maybe in 20, 30, 40 years, it's going to be a 2 billion market, do we want a 2 billion we're still thinking about, how to eat corn and so on? Or do you want a 2 billion who have been lifted beyond that point, okay, and are making choices around real value? I know what type of Africa I want. And so we realized that in terms of the solutions we provided as commercial retail bankers, which is around basically savings and a notion of transfer of funds and loans. It's interesting, okay, but it's not going to lift us, okay? And until we start getting Africans to invest and provide a real return on that investment, okay, we will move, but not very far. And one of the big reasons why Africans are not investing is that the financial services market has developed on the short end. Okay? So great things have happened. M-Pesa, you talk about M-Pesa. But look, listen, M-Pesa is not going to develop Kenya. I'm telling you, it's as simple as that. Okay? To get Kenya developed, the capital markets have to develop. All right? And you have to mobilize savings into investments, not keep money on an M-Pesa phone wallet. Okay? Now, to do that, you need public sector institutions and intermediaries that have the capacity and the clout to, in the same way as, I got into banking in Nigeria and we had 2 million bank accounts, okay? In Nigeria at the time was 3 million bank accounts, and today you have 50 million bank accounts. We need to get 60 million pension accounts. We need to have mutual funds, just like you have in China, right? With hundreds of millions of Africans, on a T+0 settlement basis. Do you get the point? Okay. What type of institution is going to do this? We spoke about private equity. And leave the private equity OECD model. Private capital makes a lot of sense. And mobilizing private capital makes a lot of sense. I told you about the Access Bank story. I never once had a conversation with a private equity player. And yet, we've mobilized more capital as Access Bank than probably the entirety of the private equity industry did at the time, okay? And if you think about people like Aliko Dangote, private equity is actually, frankly speaking, not relevant to the true growth stories of Africa today, in the way it is offered and in the way it is. But I love the idea. I love the talent and skill that goes into private equity, and it's relevant if we do it the African way. And so we want to create a platform that takes all the domain expertise of private equity, of venture capital, of insurance, of asset management, okay? And we've decided to give the project Africa's BlackRock. That's the project title. We've been working on it for a while with McKinsey, even though now that we're recruiting, they're not happy. But I mean, the notion is that over the next 10 years, we create this model, okay, that allows investment management in Africa to work. And we don't want to be the only players. I mean, we want others to follow that model. We want, just like you have, so you speak about Equity Bank in Kenya and other banks and so on. Okay, so we'd love to have this, this model replicated across Africa. To make it happen, okay, I need like 40 people from this room to join us.
That was an offer, by the way.
And frankly speaking, we're just looking for people who have the intellect, who have the innovative thought process, and who have the intuition to operate in an African context, But that's what we're doing now from let's say, professional standpoint.
So let's stick on African BlackRock, or asset management version whatever for Africa. In asset management, as you know, there's lots of tensions between active and passive investing, within active investing about different strategies, high-frequency stuff in one part, long-term investing in another, investing with ESG concerns. So since you're not bound by all the constraints of having the history of having created this organization before, and you can start with pretty much a blank sheet of paper, how do you think about the asset management business going forward in Africa? Because the metaphor of Africa's BlackRock is great, but it may not be BlackRock. It may look very different than BlackRock.
Okay, so first of all, why BlackRock? Simple, technology, okay? And those guys have badass technology, all right? And you see, technology in Africa is a transformational force that is much more relevant than it is in Europe, North America, and even Asia. Because the infrastructural constraints in Africa are huge. And the cost to overcome those constraints, to be honest, okay, are beyond the capacity of the capital available within the country, and frankly speaking, the capital outside the country that is ready to come, okay? And what we found is that the most viable means of overcoming or leapfrogging this challenge has been in technology, okay? No, I don't think I should reveal that. But the journey from a typical African asset manager outside, well, frankly, I would include South Africa, okay, to a world-class asset manager operation, okay, today can be cut short from 10 years to 18 months using technology. Simple, it's a fact, okay? So I can create for you a world-class asset manager anywhere in Africa, okay, simply by having the technology infrastructure, all right, and then having people to operate the technology, okay?
Just so I understand, you're talking about the portfolio management side of the business or the non-portfolio management side of the business, or both?
All sides of the business without the talent. Now, there's one thing to have the firm, there's another thing to have people to operate the firm, okay? So the technology bit was not easy to overcome, but that's why I don't want to share, but there's some secret sauce there, and fortune favors the brave, okay? So imagine me looking, it goes something like this. So we're looking for a team of the brightest technology people with domain expertise and experience along the likes of creating BlackRock technology, okay? So imagine this, we're debating this stuff with McKinsey, and then I get an email from a group of people who worked somewhere, who did it there, and who are looking to come to Africa. I mean, they didn't know, I mean, other than, you know, the introduction you gave of who I was, they didn't know what we were doing. So, you know, this is a bit that people don't tell you about their great stories, that there's so much luck in it. So, but, you know, I thank God for that luck. So on the technology side, I think we're well on solving it. The challenge is, of course, talent, okay? And when you're building out an enterprise, okay, there are two types of people you need. Both types must be smart. But you need people who have such a complete mastery of the subject matter, okay, that their contributions are going to be striking, okay, just based on that, okay? But then there are certain roles where those contributions are not enough. So you need also people who have strong local knowledge, what I can call domain command and control, okay? So their intuition and innovation in a local context is amazing, okay? So basically, we're looking for, our first 18 months, we're looking for 250 people. Of the 250 people, 100 are in the first category, which basically is recruits from outside Nigeria, okay? And then 150 are local. Now, if we are successful, over the next 5 to 7 years, we're going to need in total 1,000 people. Same ratio, okay? So one of the things that we're doing, or we're going to have to do, is, for example, for those who were recruiting locally, okay, and they're smart. These, I mean, to work with me, you've really done.
I gathered that, yes.
So we will probably have to send something like 20 people to schools like this every year from within our system, okay, or more, okay. And so those are for the local, okay, and obviously get, you know, over the next 18 months, 100 people who have a background of having an MBA from side school, that type of thing. Now, this is fun. So every week I've been coming out here or going to New York and talking to people like you, and these conversations have been very, very interesting. But I think for the most part, everybody has said yes. So It's very exciting. I'm not doing this, no, correct this. I'm not doing this only to make money. But there is a larger goal here, which is basically providing transformational solutions to Africa's very unique challenges.
So I want to take a few more minutes, but then go into audience questions. But this topic about public and private activity is really important. And so if we can touch on the Africa Initiative for Governance, what that's about, how does governance impact the private sector, what impact do you think you can have on the governance process? Maybe just a few words about that before we open it up to the audience.
Okay, so I've told you about my background as a child of civil servants, okay? And I've known Africa when Africa worked, okay? And let me put things into context. Chinua Achebe has written, I think, he's the most publicized author in the world. So Things Fall Apart, Arrow of God. Okay, fine. Do you know that this guy wrote 5 of those books as a civil servant in the Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation? So he was doing his job as a broadcaster and writing books that would change the world at the same time. I'm just speaking to the quality of talent that was in the civil service, okay? And there are many more, okay? Many, many more, okay? And so it's no surprise then that the University of Ibadan, the first universities, the Broadcasting Corporation, and so on, in the early 60s, these were places where people came from all over the world, including, by the way, Lee Kuan Yew, okay, to understand what standards of running a country were all about. And the schools were good. The policies around forming a country made sense, and we were on to a good thing. And then there were interruptions. In the interest of time, what is obvious is that the correlation between economic development and the quality of governance is, I think, perfect. Okay? And from even a selfish standpoint, as a businessman, I have seen what has happened when you have the right policy context. So every example, not some, every example of a great economic opportunity that's pointed to anywhere in the world as Africa has behind it the right policy context. And behind that right policy context is a public servant, elected or bureaucrat, okay, who's done a great thing. So the M-Pesa story is not contrary to what you think about, it's a private sector story. This is a story of a central banker, okay, who had a vision of life beyond traditional banking, and who was ready to take risks to recreate and re-architect the way Kenya worked. Okay? You then had a private sector that embraced it. The story of telecoms in Nigeria, a country with 60, 70 million people and 400,000 phone lines. And we'd operated that way for 30, 40 years. It's the story of a president who says, I've gone across the world and I see this device called a mobile phone. Why don't we have it in the millions that you have across the world? And you put in place you appoint a public servant, okay, and the rest is history. The story of pensions in Nigeria is similar, et cetera, et cetera. So my investment thesis actually is that in Africa, if you can meet a well-developed public servant who knows how to traverse the issues of reform, you're going to make a lot of money, okay? Now, in my personal life, okay, I've had challenges. And in my business life, I've had challenges that almost took my life. So I've been flown out of Nigeria on an air ambulance, for example. Okay, when my people didn't know whether I was coming back. And guess what caused that? I'm not going to mention the institution. But on one side, you have a central bank with a revolutionary idea around consolidation. And on the other hand, you have an institution that's meant to enable this consolidation process and put so many obstacles in the way of consolidation, okay? And I remember I was stressed to the point of, and it nearly took me, nearly took others as well. Fortunately, we have a team, and we went through it. It's no surprise when, if I mention I was going to heap praise on somebody in this room, but you might guess the institution I was talking about, so I won't do that. So, as far as I'm concerned, to change Africa, the private sector alone cannot do it. We need public sector partners, and we need capacity in the public sector of, like Hakeem said, of a level that is actually stronger and higher than we have in the private sector. And so scholarships, fellowships, at the base level, part of the reason why I try to make money is to make investments where countries are not investing. African countries are not investing in public servants. It's not enough, okay? But I think it's a start. And it's significant enough to have gotten the Nigerian government actually to embark on a public sector reform process, which was signed off, about a year and a half ago. But even in implementing that process, there are challenges. So that's what it's all about. We want to put up in Nigeria an institute of the quality of Brookings, where civil servants in Nigeria will be trained out of their brains, okay? Much like you train, yes. And I think that as we do this, all right, others will begin to do the same. But if we don't fix and address the human capital deficit in the public sector, we will be limiting Africa's opportunities and chances.
That is a great transition. For those of you who are MBAs, when we talk about systems change here and systems leaders, this is what it's about. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to all of you. And who would like to start? Again, we'll try not to hurt anybody with the microphones, but maybe we'll start with this gentleman here.
We'll get a little closer. I played rugby, so I'll try. That's it. 1, 2. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So just building on your last point, I work with the Commonwealth Secretariat, and the daily pain, not pain, but the daily work is, of course, engaging governments almost all the time. And just wanted to find your perspective. There's a growing narrative, an almost global north one around governments cannot create jobs. And this is, again, exacerbated by a few things that you mentioned, how it comes down to that one public servant who is revolutionary in their thinking, that then capitalizes, the talent, the policy and enabling environment, and so on and so forth. So firstly, what's your take on that? And secondly, if we're going to sustain and grow the revolutionary work that you're talking about here, capital markets and boosting the domestic private sector and so on, what do you think needs to change without necessarily leaving that to that one leader who then gets to get in and come up with something different? Because we know with how politics are in Africa, again, the next 10, 15, 20 years have almost been, sabotaged because of the cycle of politics. And, I'm from Kenya, and we probably know the next 2, 3 presidents, whether we like it. Whether we like it or not, just because of the political. So how do we, separate the dependence of the revolutionary, policy context to not just be that leader, but then all the work that you've been sharing? Thank you.
Okay, the first question is quite straightforward. If you look, let me just take an example of Nigeria, okay? Work back 40 years. Government and government activities, government and government-controlled activities, okay, probably accounted for, I would say, because of government's involvement in the private sector, et cetera, probably accounted for 60% of GDP. And obviously, you can link that back to the job creation effect, because honestly speaking, if you're not earning sustainable income or revenue, I don't know how you're going to pay workers, okay? And also, you look at the size of the country from a population standpoint, et cetera, the efforts of government in terms of job creation could be better felt. Today, the Nigerian government spending and government influence is less than 10% of the Nigerian economy, okay? So whatever it is that a government tries to do, at most, okay, with 200 million people, if we even take take a rough cut, right? At best, it's going to be 20%, 10% of those people. You get the point, okay? Now, it's worse because this is now the age of the knowledge economy, okay? So even if you control whatever it is you control, you are very hard put as a government, okay, to employ people so you can start it, okay? But very quickly, if you don't have the knowledge within that system employing those people, all right, you won't be able to sustain it, okay? And so, and it's not even, you're not putting people down, I mean, people in government. It's just that the economic models that we have today are so market-oriented, so competitive, globally so, that it is impossible for government, which is not built to do that, okay, to be the creator of jobs. So that's the notion, okay? And any government who wants to try should go ahead and do so, to be the mainstay of job creation in any economy. It won't work, okay? Now, in terms of your second question, I don't advocate for this messianic solution in terms of a leader, Lee Kuan Yew. But if you don't have an alternative, please, we pray for it, okay? Now, what did Lee Kuan Yew do? I visited Singapore. No, first of all, let me trundle back. You remember I told you about that executive education program that was on? And on that program was a guy in my group, was a guy in the Singaporean Air Force. And I said to him, what is a Singaporean Air Force guy doing on a program? All of us here are investment bankers or consultants and so on. What are you doing here? And he says, look, Singapore has been sending, I think, half of its talent pool to schools like this forever, okay? I'm talking his government talent pool, okay? So then why is it when it comes to systems thinking and project management and so on, you now begin to understand why the Singaporean Air Force is as effective as it tends to be, okay? So the trick is have the leader maybe as a catalyst, and that leader transforms the public service by making sure there's huge investment required, and is done on a sustainable basis.
Now, we're out of time technically, so what I'd like to propose is 3 quick questions that we'll collect across and then close with those. So 3 questions. Let's see. There's one back there.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got the mic, so why don't you start?
Yeah, Babasunde Odunuga here. My question is this. Where do we draw the line? Because I'll give an example.
Can you lift the mic?
I'll give an example of Lagos, for instance, where I come from. The government had a concession agreement, or what I call a PPP agreement with a technical firm. They built the Lekki toll gate, and it came to a point where they had to do this concession for like 20 years. So at what point do we now draw the line between government providing social amenities and services and the private sector trying to make money from their investment? So where do we draw the line? Because it came to a point, government had to buy back the concession agreement at the cost of several millions of dollars or naira at the end of the day. So because the private company wanted to make profits, and the people within the community said, no, we can't be paying tolls on a government road that should not be provided for free. So where do we now draw the line between the PPP agreements we have and, and whatever government puts in place?
Okay, so question 1, question 2. I'm not seeing any women. It's all men's hands up. Actually, oh, careful there, somebody just got hit. There's a question right there. So about 4 rows down to your right. Oh, and I see one over here. You get the last word.
My question has to go this way. Due to private sector involvement in development in every country in Africa, is there any possibility for banks to roll out single-digit loans for small businesses in order to sustain themselves?
Okay. And question 3 then is over here. The last word.
That's right. Oh, hi. My name is Pamela. First of all, thank you so much for giving an insight as to what you've been doing to improve the local community. You mentioned earlier on that there's a need for more for banks to invest in the capital rather than have them reserve. How do you get more local people as well as international countries to have more faith in the banking system of Africa? And I must say, the regulations in the EU is so complex, super complex. I think it drives everyone crazy. Do you think that Africa countries are looking to emulate that complexity of regulations that is in Africa, that is in EU, that is in UK, Europe, and America, in order to get that better confidence from investors?
Okay, so you've got government-private boundaries, you've got small business, and then you've got trust in banking.
Okay. The single-digit loan question, I'll start there. Okay. I did notice something. It looks like, because earlier on when you threw the box, everybody was catching it. I think people are getting a bit tired. And I draw an allusion to, I'm a Man U fan, and I think the PSG guy was a bit tired. I love it. Anyway, so your question is this. How do you get banks to lend at single digits when the government in those countries is borrowing at double digits? That's basically your question. Okay? And it's a good question in the sense that if we don't solve that problem, okay, you're going to have perennially this notion that the access to credit is a real challenge. And up to this point in time, that problem, people have attempted to solve that problem, at least in Nigeria, okay, through some very crude and blunt monetary direct interventions, which are not sustainable, okay? And I think it's a capital market solution we're looking for. Now, you know that if you look at the structure, if you look at the deposit structure of African banks, okay, you will find that there is a disproportionate amount of deposits on the short end of, so it's either in savings demand, okay, or time deposits, okay? And you also find that because of the nature of those products, banks are able to pay you very little on those products, okay? All right. Now, most banks in Africa, okay, built themselves on a model where you have a large spread between the deposit rate and the lending rate, okay? To bring the lending rate down, interestingly, okay, you have to get the depositors or the savers earning a lot more money on their deposits. That's the irony. So if you buy a different type of product. So I don't think that banks can offer that product, but I think that asset managers can offer that product, okay? And what we will see, okay, is, which has happened significantly in more advanced markets, is that you will find that the huge gap between deposit rates, I know that the banks are going to be unhappy with what I'm saying, but the countries are going to be happy with what I'm saying. I'm talking government. The huge gap needs to be disintermediated by asset management products. Products, and I'm not sure it's going to be single digits, but basically what you want to have is a situation where, because you have a direct relationship between the saver, or the investor, and the user of money, you bring down the spread. And to do that, you use technology. So peer-to-peer lending in Africa is actually going to have a very different effect as it has had in Europe and America, I think. And basically what peer-to-peer lending means is that if we create clearing situations where I can lend to you, and remember I was earning 3%, maybe 10% of my money, I can lend to you at 12%, 13%, do you understand? Okay, which is much lower than the 23 or 30% you're getting from the banking system. That is the beginning of this solution. And it's one of the products I think that we will be bringing to the market, but that's that. Now, to your wonderful question, and I guess it tells you why women are the solution to most of our problems. They are smarter. Well, there were like three questions there, but I think I'm going to paraphrase them into this, which is basically that what is it going to take to create a public-private sector solution that is enduring to Africa's development problems? And I'll tell you what it's going to take. It's going to take schools like this convening very, very powerful sessions, not necessarily here, but in Africa, okay, in combination with institutions like that which we are creating, where we put government and the private sector in the same room as vested parties. We lock ourselves in that room and say we must build the trust and ensure we have the right human capital and talent, okay, to dissect these issues and provide a solution. And quick example, if you go to Nigeria for the past 2 years, 3 years actually, you will find this funny thing where you drive on the bridges and you see trucks, lots of trucks, miles and miles of trucks, okay, on the bridges, permanently parked on the bridges, okay? And that's because they are queues to get into the port. So today you actually pay demurrage of about 9 months to get your container out of the port, just simply because you can't get your truck into the port. Now ask yourself, are you saying in Nigeria that we don't have the people who can find a solution to this silly problem?
Well, we're creating one of those across the European Channel, but that's a different matter. So.
But there are so many problems that can be solved with the right convening and the right talent in the room and a will to, So we have to do things differently. But we need to create the type of institutions and partnerships that allow us to do that. And I forgot the last question.
The line between public and private.
Oh, the line between public and private. This is going to be a very controversial answer. In the sense that with globalization, with technology, with this thing called social media, I'm not too sure where that line is anymore. Mm-hmm. A businessman has taken over the political economy of the US, okay, with very little infrastructure, very little capacity, very little history, okay, and is influencing public policy in a way nobody has in a long time, okay? I don't know if you know where I'm going with this. So I'm not too sure whether we should focus on that line or whether we should focus on what the output is. Is it for good? Is it sustainable? Is it in the interest of the greater numbers? And maybe concentrate on that and spend less time worrying where it's coming from, because I don't think we have that power anymore. Social media has weaponized ideology and doctrine in ways that we don't have control anymore. Mm-hmm. And what is government is debatable. Two things on the last note. Every time I spoke in Oxford, very strange things happened thereafter. So I spoke at a session, and this was 1 week before Brexit, and 9 of us said the Brexit vote was going to go one way. One predicted the right way it would go. And I hadn't gotten over it when I was on a plane. I got on that plane believing that when I landed, I would be seeing Hillary Clinton announced as the winner of, and we landed, and I couldn't understand what I was seeing on my phone. Okay, and I was flying from here, by the way. Okay, now it's not about Oxford predicting wrongly, but but it's just more about my belief that at this point in time, it's more about me understanding what the world wants, as opposed to thinking that I can dictate or force it.
That's a great close. Can I just summarize so much that you've talked about? Power of Ideas, a book changed your life. Putting customers first changed your bank. Technology and talent both have to be equally strong in order to succeed. Taking on big, bold challenges like creating Africa's BlackRock is within scope. Strong business and strong government both have to succeed for things to work. And I think in your last comment, putting purpose first seems pretty important. Is that a fair summary?
You're the dean, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So our next session is going to focus on technology and all that it holds for us. We are going to bring some chairs up, and in a moment, I will invite our panelists up. But I'd like to pose a quick question. We didn't ask this at the beginning of the day, but I would like to know, raise your hand if this is your first time ever to visit Oxford. Wow, well, welcome. We're so glad that you're here today. So I'd like to invite our next speakers up to our stage. Okay, we're going to get started again. We're trying to keep things on track so that we can get to our next break and get all of the remaining speakers that we have for the day. So once again, I will not introduce all of our speakers, but I will say that it is being facilitated, this next discussion, by Aaron Fu, who is the Managing Director at Mest Africa. So let's welcome Aaron and the rest of these speakers. Thank you.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Wes, and thanks, guys, for inviting me today. It's been such a great discussion. I need your help with this panel, guys. I would love this panel to be the most interactive panel of the day. I'll make sure to leave a lot of time for questions. And I'm really privileged to be joined on stage today with some absolute luminaries in the African tech scene. Most of my panelists have not only built their own businesses, done research around it, but really are trailblazing their way across. Andrew, on the extreme right, he's one of the most well-known economists in Nigeria. He actually considers himself Nigerian, living there for 10 years, with a wide range, engaging with a wide range of industrial clients, but is also a secret entrepreneur at heart. Charlene has been pushing boundaries when it comes to blockchain in Africa. I remember many years ago, some people would ask, what can you even do with blockchain in Africa? And BitPesa was there from the very, very start and has really grown to a very large Pan-African force. So really great to have you with us, Charlene. Eric, of course, needs no introduction. Eric Hertzman is often quoted as being the father of the Kenyan startup ecosystem by founding the iHub. He's also a founder of Brick, which has recently made some really great strides providing Wi-Fi all across the country. Caroline, one day I'll get this right. besides from being the most popular table at the employers' fair over lunch, she's a partner at Dalberg, has been living and working across Africa for 7 years, and has been deliberately morphing from role to role and from focus area to focus area to really understand how to create systemic change. So welcome, Caroline. I want to start off by just sort of framing this idea of technology within the overall African growth story, right? There's been this idea that 2/3 of Africans already have access to a mobile phone, but many are still lacking basic water, reliable energy. Why are we even up here talking about technology when there's so much more pressing issues to look at? And this is sort of a broad opener, so I'm not sure anyone, please begin. Andrew.
You want me to start?
Yeah.
First, thank you so much for being here to the Africa Business Alliance. Great pleasure for me to be here. I was at Oxford 36 years ago, in fact, so great pleasure to come back. Let me start out by just giving maybe an economic grounding for why the technology is so critical in all of this. So in the Nigerian context, we have 87 million people in absolute poverty. So if you think in the sub-Saharan context, we have over 200 million, 250 million people. It is mathematically impossible for Africans to get out of poverty without a private sector that's 10 to 15 times larger than what we saw today. And of course, you just listened to Ig talk about, obviously the public sector has a relationship to it, but it's not possible to get out of poverty without a much larger private sector. We had earlier in the day, we talked about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. In 2050, there's basically going to be 3 poles of population, which are Africa, 2 billion, South Asia, 2 billion, East Asia, 2 billion. It is not possible to be prosperous unless Africa stops selling raw materials. Because if you're 2 billion people and you're selling raw materials, and raw materials are 5 to 10% of the value chain, then you're not going to be able to be wealthy or prosperous. And of course, who can Africans sell to? They're unlikely to sell into East Asia. They might sell a little bit into South Asia. The only way Africans will be prosperous are Africans selling to Africans. So that's a kind of context for all of that. Within that world of 2050, where we have 2 billion people, there are many, many sectors, including the most basic ones like water and food, where it is not physically possible to deliver, to provide these without technology. And let me give you 2 examples and stop. The first one, of course, is energy. Even if we did the maximum economic grid in Africa, which is difficult, in 2050 there would still be 600 million people that do not get power from the grid. So they need to produce their power in situ with a technology that works in situ. The second example is healthcare. We have 2 billion people in Africa. It is not feasible to have the Western model where you have 500 people per doctor and a certain number of nurses. You could not get that amount of manpower. You could not get it distributed unless we have some technology solution that includes remote sensing, that includes some type of AI. We can't deliver healthcare. So those are 2 examples that show to deliver the most basic things that we need to 2 billion people in Africa, we're going to need technology at the heart of it.
Yeah.
I think you can extend that past. You can extend that past this healthcare. I mean, education is something we've delved in a little bit. If you look across the continent, you've got a massive number of students. The youth bulge, right? We have this youth bulge coming up. We already have a hard enough time doing education the way we've been doing it, which has its own issues. But we can't even keep up with that number if we don't apply some type of technological injection into it. Then it's not going to change very quickly, and it's not going to educate all the youth that are coming up. So I think there's multiple industries. Aaron, we stand on enough stages together. You hear my pithy statement all the time, which is you can't have a 21st century economy without power and connectivity.
Yep.
Right. So all these other things are verticals that sit on top of those 2 foundational pieces. And I think while we often in the West, people get very paternalistic about, oh, how about water, how about healthcare, all this other stuff, right? Africans themselves need to make a decision on what they want and drive for that. And if one of the things that they need first is power and connectivity, then they need to drive that discussion.
Sure.
So I think it's important to recognize that business in Africa definitely needs the basics before you even get to technology, which I see personally as an enabler rather than a solution in and of itself. So we've talked a lot today about how there's so many amazing natural resources across the continent, and there's amazing human capital as well. There's a long way to go in terms of kind of basic infrastructure, the roads. So if you're a landlocked country, getting your goods out to port is difficult. Without having electricity and internet connectivity, it's hard to do business. We started our business in Kenya, and one of the inspirations for what we did was looking at the power of mobile money. So it wasn't that mobile money in and of itself transformed the economy, but it was because mobile money enabled people to do business more easily and save time, as opposed to having to travel to the village with cash, or having to stuff money in an envelope and get on a matatu and cross the country. So I really see technology, whether it's mobile phones or data-based apps or blockchain technology, in and of itself, it's not the solution, but it can enable and empower entrepreneurs and large businesses and governments to do things a lot faster and more cost effectively, and therefore provide better solutions to their consumers and citizens.
Great. And I think, M-Pesa's sort of mobile money is a great segue into something else that I want to talk about a little bit. Technology in Africa is often, framed with this idea of leapfrogging, right? The idea that Africa would be able to skip by lots of the, mid-steps that the rest of the world take and sort of, emerge in this utopia of blockchain-powered payments across the entire continent, using the afro to pay on blockchain. Is this true? Is this a real thing in the worlds that you live in? Because from where I sit, I look at M-Pesa, being a 10-year-old technology, and really, it hasn't really changed all that much. It hasn't really been super innovative across those 10 years. I look at the iPhone, and it's changed so significantly, right? Is this idea of leapfrogging still valid? And do you think that in the respective spaces that you work in, do you see real-life examples of this?
I would say the devil is always in the detail with these kind of things. So it's great for us to talk leapfrogging. It's great to say, we need to do value added on all of our agricultural products. And there's these wonderful sweeping statements that make for great sound bites, but actually that don't make for commercially viable opportunities. And the necessity to be clear-eyed about that and consider what is truly your source of competitiveness, and how does that break down across different products and across different sectors? It's not good enough to say Africa just needs to start adding value to its agricultural produce. We recently did a really deep dive on a number of agricultural products in Rwanda, and as many of you probably know, avocados and pineapples grow like crazy in Rwanda. But not just in Rwanda. And if you want to sell them to Europe and the US, where they can command high margins, guess what? Both of those products get shipped. They don't get flown out. And where do you ship Rwandan avocados and pineapples from? The port of Mombasa. Guess what grows around Mombasa? Avocados. So for that to be viable, your Rwandan avocados need to be harvested at a price that is lower than the Kenyan avocados by the cost of transporting them overland to Kenya or Tanzania, where you ship them from. It's that level of detail and level of granular understanding that I feel, is not often looked at enough when you look at big macroeconomic policies and put these huge industrial parks in place that then end up not being used enough, because there wasn't enough of an in-depth understanding of where there's a truly commercially viable opportunity and where therefore private capital is going to come to the table, whereas where there is actually more of a need for development capital or public capital to actually bridge things. So leapfrogging, yeah, opportunities here and there, yeah. But the devil is in the detail of identifying those and focusing on those that actually hold proper potential instead of the sweeping statements that aren't going to get us anywhere.
I agree that the devil's in the details, but I think there's going to be a lot more leapfrogging than sort of the occasional one. Let me just give you two quick examples from Nigeria. So one is Nigeria has, maybe perhaps behind India now, but had the most advanced banking biometrics. So you think we have a big problem, corruption, and people move money in and out of the banks, take out cash. So 4 years ago, we brought in a 10-fingered biometric system that every bank account in the country is linked. And it links every business account. Every director of the company has to have all 10 fingers. So I'm director of PwC. We've got bank accounts at 10 banks, my private account. They're all linked together. The impact that has had on reducing corruption, ghost workers, has just been enormous. And it's much more, when I bank, go do my banking in Canada to send my kids money, it's primitive compared to what we have in Nigeria. So there's one example of leapfrogging. You talk about agriculture. Fantastic young company in Nigeria called Agromol that combines satellite imagery, knowledge of the topography, and then creates bespoke on-the-ground programs for extension for the farmers. And what they've managed to do is, because they're so accurate in their advice to the farmers, they then allow the farmers to be able to borrow because they become creditworthy on that. But again, this is a leapfrogging. It's taking the satellite data, it's taking the local data, combining it all together, then creating a financial product that can finance the farmer. So, those are two examples that I bump into every day. I think as we look in Africa, and as I said, I think we're going to have to, there'll be places we don't leapfrog, but there's going to be a lot of places we have to leapfrog if we're going to be successful.
I would love to hear Eric's point of view as well on this, because you're providing a new way of connecting people to the internet, right? Is the future of Kenya's internet, balloon and matatu powered?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think this whole idea of leapfrogging is sometimes how you define that matters. So I think, yeah, one of the next waves of leapfrogging is going to come in that internet connectivity space. And it comes because in Africa, we have different challenges, right? And so when we finally start getting our engineers, getting our business people solving and creating the solutions, the products, the solutions on the ground, and solving it at that level, it quickly can expand across the rest of the continent, but also other places like Asia and Latin America. So, for example, in the connectivity space, it's really easy to get terrestrial cable or fiber in Europe or the US, in some parts of Asia, right? And in Africa, it's not. It's because there's a dispersed population. It doesn't have the same ROI to do terrestrial cable across these vast distances. So why are we thinking about the way data centers and the way data moves in Africa the same way? Why are we going to do a copy and paste from Europe? Doesn't make sense.
Yep.
So let's think about how the paradigm of how data moves and where it needs to be stored. How about a distributed data storage system instead of a centralized one? Those kind of things. So that's a new way to think about data centers as a whole, and also a new way to think about distribution of content. Okay, but there's other things too. Like, what are the other hard things to do in Africa, especially when you have governments who don't have maybe the right amount of money to put towards infrastructure? So roads is another example, right? Like everybody, because I'm in tech, everybody thinks, I always think the best solution for us is something to do with tech. I actually think it's just fixing roads, right? More roads, better roads is more and better for everything, and it ripples across everything we do, right? But we're not going to have enough money to build all those roads. So you have, the zip lines of Rwanda, right, which are going in and saying, okay, well, let's start with at least medical deliveries by drone. And so that's a really interesting way for governments who don't have who have more control and not as much legacy built into their regulatory environment to come and say, you know what, sure. It might be really hard to do this in one of those Western countries, but we're going to change everything in our country to allow you to just try this new thing. And so I think leapfrogging will come and will continue to come in Africa at a pretty rapid pace around areas that are high cost to get involved in today, and with lower cost technology options that actually are a real paradigm shift in the way people think.
Yep.
I would just add another comment that, and by the way, I'm very pro-technology as a former computer science major who almost went into artificial intelligence. I mean, I always hesitate to use the word leapfrogging because, it's become a bit of a cliche, and people like to give the example of, because there weren't landlines across Africa, it was a lot easier to, just leapfrog, exactly, to mobile phones, et cetera. I mean, I guess I would say in terms of access to technology, it also has a implication with the talent. So I think one of, not to sound negative Nancy, but I think there's two limitations to leapfrogging in addition to the basic infrastructure limitations. One is the tech talent. So I think this is where capacity building and education and having even more tech programs across the continent, as there are developing, and certainly there are companies like Andela and Moringa School in Kenya that are building that capacity. And then we've talked a little bit about regulation today. So I think in some environments, and we work across about 10 different markets on the continent, there are some countries where it's easier to quote unquote leapfrog and use unproven, unregulated technology, and then other markets it's very hard to. One of those is blockchain technology, with cryptocurrency being a subset of that. So I think those are a couple of the other constraints, but I think if we address some of those challenges, there's so much potential.
Beautiful. I want to spend a lot of the next part of this panel talking about the enabling ecosystems that we have around sort of technology in Africa, whether that's sort of government or whether that's sort of capital flows. But before I do that, I would like to take a bit of a break and turn over to the audience for maybe 1 or 2 questions in between. Like I said, I do want to try and be the most interactive panel this today. So please. Sounds like you've got a big enough voice. Let's go.
For the local investors, that is. Right. Did everybody hear my question? So the question is, from an investment perspective, for the technology or innovation perspective, ecosystem in Africa, to enable these so-called leapfroggers, do we need to educate local investors more about the transformative effects of technology, and do we need to incentivize them? So, for instance, in the UK, you have SEIS, you have EIS, and all sorts of tax breaks. In the US, you have similar, etc. Particularly in the context of this, Africa free trade, continental free trade agreement thing. So, how, what do you guys think about what that looks like and how we can attract local people or local investors to put money into enabling the technology ecosystem in Africa?
Yeah, well, I think you just basically, preempted the entire next half of the panel. Because I do think sort of like capital is, an inhibitor and then also enabler of growth in tech so far. And I think we wanted to talk a little bit about the capital in the wider context, right? I think on one end of the spectrum, you've got DFIs and donors. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got, an angel investor sitting in Lagos. I would love to hear from the panel, where do you see sort of, sources of capital being most effective to drive tech in Africa?
Can I challenge the question a little? Because from where I'm sitting, yes, access to capital is a challenge for innovation across the continent, and we spent a lot of time talking about that already, but I actually don't think there's more capital flowing to technology and technology innovative solutions than there is to many other parts of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So we're saying there's a shortage of capital. You're in a relatively capital flush subsector. So I wouldn't want to ask, why is the capital not coming to technology and technological innovation? Because it's disproportionately coming to technological innovation. There's still a shortage, but it's disproportionately coming there.
I was going to say, it can still be not enough.
Yeah. Yes,
right?
Yeah.
I think
but I'm not sure that I would be, like, if I were to try and tackle that, I wouldn't try to get even more of the limited capital to come to technology and innovation. I would try to attract more capital in the first place to innovations on the continent. Because if you just, in an environment where there's shortage, where you're already taking a bigger portion of the pie, attracting more capital to you, it's going to come at the expense of something else that also needs investment.
I don't think it's a zero-sum game, though. I think there's more money that's sitting on the sidelines that isn't coming in.
Yes.
So some of that like non-tech stuff. And the problems we have with capital aren't just about the amount or the sector even sometimes. It's also about the premium we pay. Like, I have to raise capital myself for my business, right? And if I have to raise it in Africa, I pay a premium. If I have to raise it in the States, I would pay a premium, but it's still cheaper though. Thank God, right? So those of us who can, we do go overseas to get that money, right? There's a host of challenges built into that big bucket question you asked, by the way, right? Which is what you're seeing here. But there is definitely still a lack of capital across all sectors. The amount of people, it's really stunning to me, the amount of people who think that they need to put a couple, if you want to take a sector across Africa and you think you can do that with $100 million, you're out of your mind, right? Across 54 countries, you want to take $100 million and put that to work, right? No, you've got to have hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And we sometimes forget that. There's friction in the system, and we need more capital coming in than we even have today. Now, thank God, it's so much further than it was before. When we started the iHub in 2010, there was no investors. There was no angel investors. There was no seed investors in Nairobi at all, okay? You were getting friends and family money, and that was it.
I want the audience to understand the scale of the issue here, okay? So I think AFDB came out and said that this year's growth, GDP per capita, is going to be 3.4% per year, 3.4% this year. So our population growth is about 2.8%. So GDP per capita in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is going to grow at 0.6%, which means we're basically standing still. To make a difference to unemployment and poverty in Africa, we need to grow at 6 to 8%. To grow at 7%, we need to have between 26 and 28% of GDP in gross capital formation, just the technical economist term. I mean, you invest, if it's invested poorly, it's wasted, you don't get anything, but assuming it's invested properly, that's the level of investment. That number for sub-Saharan Africa is $200 billion a year. We don't have, there is no domestic source. I mean, how do we get that number up to 200 billion? There's only really two major sources in our view. One is for the domestic, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the concept of dead capital, like DeSoto, and we have a huge amount of locked up assets that need to, and Ig talks about this, he's not here now, quite a lot in Nigeria. We need to unlock, that's our source of domestic capital, and it makes a real difference. The only other place to get capital that we can't supply it is outside of Africa. It's not ideal to take, but we need to take it. But I think the session at lunchtime was very interesting because, of course, one of the biggest barriers to getting the outside capital, so you have negative interest rates in Europe, and we don't get enough capital with great returns. Why are we not getting it? Well, one of the biggest barriers is our reputation. And if I could ask everyone in this room to do one thing for Africa, do what you can to improve our reputation, because that would have the single biggest catalytic impact on being able to solve these problems.
I would love to hear from Charlene, because according to Caroline, you should have money just being thrown at you right now.
No.
For your age.
No, that's not what I was saying. But I was saying that you are not at a deficit compared to other sectors, and therefore your focus should be where do you raise how do you bring other sources of capital in, and how do you domestically raise capital, rather than how are you trying to get a bigger portion of too small a pie that you already have a disproportionately big portion of. Don't paraphrase and say money is flowing in.
Money's flowing everywhere, especially into blockchain, right? I mean.
Well, so I'll kind of go somewhat top down, and then, so I think broadly speaking, I agree. We need to make the investment pie bigger, and I loved the investment capital panel earlier because those are some organizations that are doing really big deals across the continent. And I agree also that of the smaller percentage of the small pie that goes to investment in African startups, a larger percentage goes to tech companies. And there's some great analysis by VC for Africa if you want to look into this more. So we're lucky and privileged to be a tech company, but I will say from our experience, we've raised money both on the continent as well as abroad. But I think to Eric's point, I would echo that it was easier to raise money from outside of Africa, from investors that, quite frankly, haven't done business across the continent, but were willing to take a chance on an unproven technology because we made a strong business case. And we received we do have both Kenyan and Nigerian investors, but we received quite a lot of skepticism from many of the investors who, even though we had proven track record on the continent in multiple countries, they were very skeptical of a new technology and a lack of regulatory clarity. So I think as a company, we have faced a harder challenge raising money on the continent. And I think this goes to risk profile and adding to blockchain technology. It's like, so you're an African business that does blockchain technology. It's like risk to the X risk out, you know. So I think it's quite challenging, and I think it's a two-way street, right? So investors need to be more open-minded to investing in emerging markets and emerging technologies, right? And it's up to the entrepreneurs, you know, so for those of you guys out there who are already running businesses or thinking about it, we also have a mandate to kind of, you know, take the scariness out of the technology that we're implementing. There's nothing that drives me more crazy than a geeky tech entrepreneur getting on stage or meeting with an investor and not speaking in layman's terms, right? If you can't get your investor to understand the problem that you're solving and you just go straight into the technology solution, there's no chance you're gonna get them to invest in you. So I think it's a two-way street. And whether it's blockchain technology or machine learning or mesh networking, you know, it's about really communicating what is the problem that you're trying to solve and how does your solution actually address that problem, and how is this not technology looking for a problem to solve?
Beautiful. And I guess maybe taking a few steps back, you know, Andrew, you talked a little bit about how we should all play our part to addressing this capital shortfall. You know, a lot of donors and a lot of DFIs have put in substantial amounts of capital into technology, and especially into startups across Africa. And I think certainly in East Africa, we've seen that sort of skew a little bit of what these technology startups look at, right? The number of times I've seen a sanitation times energy and employment startup is just incredible. And you know, I think there's a lot to be said about, you know, enhancing, you know, how that capital is deployed. Simultaneously, if you look at sort of the pure commercial angle, right? The typical story of a Nigerian angel investor who put in, you know, $20,000 into you, but is giving you a phone call every day asking for his returns. You know, that's all completely on the other end of the spectrum, right? Where he doesn't care so much about, you know, sanitation and all that. How do we go about, you know, catalyzing, you know, making this pie bigger, and perhaps making this pie sort of more effective as well, you know, from sort of the people that are already contributing significant amounts?
Yeah, so I come back to what I said earlier about sort of really understanding your source of competitiveness and understanding the viability of your underlying business case. There's many of these, and there's a public good and sort of exploration nature to some of the technologies in their very early stage, which require philanthropic capital or require more public capital to get to a point where they're proven enough, or to create a public good that allows others to build on it, such as sort of really deep insight of consumer segmentation in underbanked populations, so that financial service providers can develop products and offerings, digital and non-digital, to serve those populations. However, often those making the choices to deploy that capital early on aren't informed enough and aren't clear-eyed enough about the potential further down the line, and therefore invest that capital in things that may not hold enough of a commercial business case without realizing that. And then you get the debate that donors have a lot where they say, we want to be catalytic and we want to unlock this. But if you don't do the analysis of, can you actually unlock something that's then commercially viable and bring in commercial players, then you have to accept that concessional capital and philanthropic capital will need to continue going into this thing because you created something that has no commercial viability. It may have a lot of social impact, and it may be a very good reason to deploy that capital and continue deploying it, but you can't have it both ways. You need to understand what it is you're building and what the commercial viability of that is, so that you know where you're going to evolve it into. So that kind of concessional capital, donor capital, or philanthropic capital can play a really important role, either before or alongside commercial capital. But unless and until there's clear enough of an understanding of where this could evolve into and where the commercial viability is, it can also spread itself too thinly over things that actually have a limited future. And then comes the really painful cutoff point where a donor says, like, your grant has run out, and then there's a big black hole because the thing that was stood up is actually not winning the competition for capital. And Geeta said that really nicely on the panel when she was talking about bringing pension fund money in, etc. It's one thing to articulate that you have a viable business case. That's not how you win capital, actually. You win capital by beating the other demands for that capital. So just having a viable business case is necessary but insufficient, because the investor has plenty of opportunities to place his or her capital, and you somehow need to win that game.
Andrew, I love your take on this.
Well, I think we were talking a little bit earlier today. I think one sort of tangential issue is we have an obsession in Africa with startups and entrepreneurialism and SMEs, and the entrepreneurial spirit in Africa is so strong. And I'm an entrepreneur as well, so I'm guilty of it. But I think in many ways, actually, some of these technologies and innovations, we need big companies to step up and actually do it. I mean, it's not, I'm sure many of you are considering going out to be an entrepreneur in Africa, and it's a fantastic thing, and if it's the right thing at the right time, go for it. But you don't have to, first off, you're going to work to 100, so you've got time later to do it. You can get experience, and I mean, one of the big things in Nigeria, and I'm sure across Africa that's true, is the impact of the big companies on the entire business, not just tech, but just on the business environment is incredible. So we have 1,000 people. We're the biggest hire of grads in Nigeria. I was at an event this week at Citibank. The impact of Citibank Nigeria on the economy is incredible because of the people who have been trained there. So I would like to see actually more thinking of the biggest companies on how to deploy technologies, because to expect this, you have a small startup, they have some idea, it may work somewhere else, they want to bring it here, they've got to raise capital, social capital, they don't know about all of these things that you're asking them to do is, I think, too much. And also, people go on and keep talking about the SMEs creating the most jobs. The reason they create the jobs is because the big companies are not creating enough jobs. Yeah. It's not by choice that people necessarily want to have a very difficult or uncertain kind of livelihood. If we have big African champions, they then create ecosystems that you get SMEs that all work without it. But in many cases, they're the only ones that have got sufficient resources to drive through some of these technological innovations on that. So I'd like us to think about what role the big companies can play more than just the one individual with a good idea. Sure. We're putting all this pressure on this individual to make Africa transform.
And I'd love to hear from the rest of the panel on this as well. Do the big companies in Africa actually get technology and how to use it effectively and how to work with it? Because I haven't seen a whole bunch of those examples just yet.
I think there's a bunch of bright people working at these big companies who can, they go to school places like this, and then they go there, and they're operationally excellent. They're really good at running their company, but they're also part of an incumbent who his value is based on being defensive and not offensive. So they tend to not want innovation. Like, most big companies actually don't want innovation. They say they want innovation, but they actually don't want innovation because that means they... Just enough to stay incumbent. Yeah, just enough to stay there. They want to block everything else out. Enough. Right? Yeah. And so I think we need the small guys out there kind of building new things, and they need support. And one of the biggest gaps is the public support, so the government support of those companies. That's missing almost everywhere. But how do you inject now? If there's something that I think would be interesting in that, and Andrew, if you have a better way to do this, I'm all ears. I think it's how do you get the smaller companies who have really interesting ideas to get injected into the bigger ones? So in the U.S., the way that's handled is acquisition, and then you either get it killed off or you get it injected into the DNA of the company, right? And that's a leadership problem usually in that large company. But even those large companies are still fairly young. Right, the ones who are doing a lot of that, well, not all of them, I guess. But it's, I maybe this is just because of my background too, being a startup guy and being a founder and a builder, is I've worked with these large companies in East Africa, and it is unreal. Okay, I'll give you one story. So we were working with a very large bank, to be unnamed, and we had to get the mobile screen portal, for their new service approved. That took a week and 11 signatures, all the way to the board, to have them decide that yes, we're going to change the screen to this.
Just a week? That's pretty fast.
It's amazing.
That was with the CEO pushing on it, right? It's that kind of bureaucracy that gets in the way of this growth. Right, and so I think there's a few good examples of big companies who have done some stuff, but it's very rare, and that's just by the nature of that organization's DNA. It's hard for them to actually push something new.
Charlene, please.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear about I'm sitting between startup guy, and I know you're an entrepreneur as well, but representing corporate, and I also came from Deloitte Consulting. Pre-MBA in the States. So, I've also been in the private sector side, working with Fortune 500 companies and then going to, being employee number 2 at a small company in Africa. I do think there's a role for the private sector and, big companies like when I was working in agriculture in East Africa, seeing the impact of companies like Nestle and Unilever. Coca-Cola is the classic stereotypical example. The distribution that those FMCG companies can make across Africa far exceeds what a small startup in one country in Africa can do. So I think there's a role for every piece of the value chain. So there's certain things that, and going to the banking sector, BitPesa has never wanted to be a bank. We rely on banks to be what they do best, which is custodians of funds. What we're trying to disintermediate is cross-border transfers and the reliance on SWIFT and the US dollar as an intermediary currency. That we're convinced we can do better than a Citibank, and we do. But we're never going to be holding $1 trillion in funds. But are we the kind of company that would be beneficial to a Pan-African bank? Yes. And I attended a really great talk by the head of digital banking at Barclays, and granted, I don't know if this was lip service, but she was saying that Barclays is quite pro partnering with fintechs or maybe acquiring them because fintechs are dynamic, they're quick, they can change gears very quickly. When you're a little tugboat, you can change direction very quickly. When you're a giant cargo ship, you're turning that wheel for a long time before you're actually moving a degree in a different direction. So I think it is important, and it's not rocket science. There are things that startups are better positioned to do, and then there are things that big companies are better positioned to do. I think we are starting to see some collaboration, talking about bridging the ecosystem, but I think there's sort of a missing middle, right? So there's a lot of talk and buzz, and there's dozens of incubators and accelerators that focus on early stage startups across the continent, and so there's amazing ones like iHub, is a great example of a place where innovation is born. Then, as we heard earlier today, you got PE. Investments coming in, but what happens to these businesses that are neither startup nor PE level deal size? So I think there's also in the ecosystem, there's a missing middle for kind of a scale up, which I would define as, not necessarily by revenue, but maybe you've exceeded 50 to 75 people, but you're not like a 500 to 5,000 person company. There's actually very few investors that deal with Series A, Series B, hence having to go back out for that bridge capital.
Yeah, but I do think we're on the path towards getting more of those scale-ups up there. It's interesting, the big celebrations in sort of the Kenyan or sort of the African raises recently have been $10 million, $20 million raises. But when I get to Silicon Valley and speak to the Y Combinator guys, they're like, well, that's kind of like a small angel round, right? And then we're sort of celebrating that as sort of the top tier of raises, right? I'm failing horribly at being the most interactive panel. I do apologize. So I do want to push this back to the audience again for any questions. The box going around, maybe let's start in the center over there, and then I'll come to you. Yep. Watch out, big, orange.
Hi, can you hear me? Good. My name is Sadiq Sakanuru, Berkeley class of 14. And my question is, what role does artificial intelligence play in the technology game in Africa?
All right.
I can answer a little bit of that. I think as we get more of Africa instrumented, it's going to play a larger and larger role across every sector. So, you know, talking about things around sensors and that the amount of data that's starting to roll off is immense. And so I think AI will have it'll have a growing and increased, especially when we're trying to reduce costs. You know, if we can train up the algorithms the right way, then we can do a lot more with a lot less.
Yeah, beautiful. I think there's a question up front, please, and then we'll go.
My name's Bright. I work in green infrastructure, smart cities, so AI, that sort of thing. Now, my question is with regards to what we've talked about with roles of government, roles of the private sector, and my question is with regards to the different roles that we're talking about. You're saying the big multinationals have their place, the small startups have their role, and what is government's role? In particular, I'd give you a small example. A few months ago, I wanted to buy something for people in the village, and I asked them, what shall I get you? I'm coming back home. And they told us, just buy us internet bundles. I said, you don't want shoes? No, just internet bundles.
Yeah, yeah.
And to me, where does government in this space actually, what does government need to do? Should we start, is internet, is connectivity, physical connectivity is a public good. We agree government invests heavily in roads and everyone is happy about that. In the digital space, sure, should we make that also a public good? Should we say, well, internet provision in some areas should be the government's responsibility, and services such as virus protection, then that is the private enterprise's role. If we are to actually actualize this fourth revolution we go on about.
I think we can spend a lot of time on that one, what should be a public good or not. It was interesting, sort of there was a study in Kenya recently around how, you know, millennials age, I think 18-21, if left with $1, would rather buy a data bundle than food. It was just like, oh my God. But Eric, maybe let's start with you, and I would love, Caroline, your view as well. Like, are you a public good? Should you even exist?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm maybe uniquely positioned to answer this question. So we look a lot at the affordability of the internet problem, right? Connectivity really breaks down to two buckets. One is accessibility. Do I have a signal near me, and do I have a device that I can use to get online? And then there's affordability, which is the other side of the equation, and that's actually where we're falling down. Okay, so the idea of buying bundles for people who live in the village, right? I don't think this should be, let me rephrase that. For most governments, I don't think that should be their burden. I think that there's a private sector way to answer this question, and there's models that companies like ours are putting in place at BRIC to do that. I think there's a way but this is where we go back to that leapfrogging question early on, which is like, okay, but let's think differently about it. We have an opportunity here with more of a blank slate to actually come back and say, okay, if the business model if we need to have free internet for the consumer, and we do, by the way, because the numbers across the continent are staggering, which is about any country you go into, it's an 80-20 rule, where people who already have devices, so they already have smartphones, 80% of them cannot connect to the internet regularly, okay? That's crazy, right? They already have the devices, they already have the signal around them. So if we're gonna change that, how do we think about providing the internet for free? What's the business model for free? Because it's not free. The internet costs something, right? Who's gonna pay? Well, it doesn't have to be the government either. There's also other private sector that can come in and do different things on that. So in our case, we charge them for caching and compute at the edge. We charge them for digital engagement with our users, all that kind of stuff, right? There's different ways to think about this that the private sector can solve, and public sector can do things like provide subsidies, tax windows that allow you to do different things. And you know what? They can copy and paste some of those from other countries around the world. There's plenty of opportunities there, but by and large, our governments are too short-sighted and think about collecting money up front too much instead of long-term, that we get crazy, licensing agreements with, like, for spectrum in Kenya, it's like $25 million for the 700 megahertz LTE spectrum. Like, who the hell's gonna pay that, right? They're not thinking long-term on how to get that revenue. Anyway, a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't think the government's the answer.
I do want to get to more questions. So you had one, and then we'll go out the back. Oops. Sorry, just right.
Thank you. These are hilarious. Thank you. My name is Mohammed. Sorry, I have to hold it closer?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Even closer. Yeah.
You're loving this. My name is Mohammed Lashan. I work for an economic development consulting firm called Oxcon. I had a question that sort of bridges the conversation that we're having earlier during lunch, actually, which connects to the morning, which was more macro. So I'm a strong believer that there's no such thing as, when we're talking about tech businesses, there's no such thing as a non-tech business. Everything is tech to some degree, right? And we continue, and when I say we, I mean looking a lot at on the investor side, but also on the incubator side, which I've known a little bit in North Africa. We continue to have that distinction between tech businesses and non-tech businesses, even though they're tech-enabled. While at the same time, we have this recognition that if we're going to be competitive in the future, then our non-tech businesses will have to be tech-enabled because we're not going to compete globally on labor costs, right? So consequently, there's a gap that needs to be bridged here between the tech investment community, shall we say, and incubators, all of that, and the non-tech businesses that are technology-enabled. It's very hard. Like one case that I've seen was a guy who sort of was applying to incubators in Cairo, to technology incubators because that's where the money was. But their business was a carpenter that was basically was using essentially machines to do a lot of the things that were like traditional designs. So it's actually really good. They had a really good business plan. They ultimately
Sorry, I am going to have to ask for a question.
Sorry, I apologize. So basically my question is how do we bridge that gap between what we perceive as purely tech and tech-enabled non-tech businesses, especially when it comes to small company financing? Apologies for being long.
No.
Sure. I mean, I guess I would push back a little bit, and I love you, Mohammed. I think, yeah, I hear your point when every business needs to be somewhat tech-enabled, right? Like, no business can really operate without email and some sort of communication tool to communicate amongst your staff, et cetera. And I would actually highlight a point that we haven't really talked about, which is, I think, a challenge of some tech innovations to scale across the continent, not because of the technology, which theoretically is in the cloud and can cross borders. I think the issue is really, a piece is the investment, but I think it's more so like freedom of movement, which we've been talking about all day. It's like the talent issue and having, I'll give a clear example. I do a lot of regulatory affairs for BitPesa. Our head of regulatory affairs is a Kenyan woman based in Nairobi. 3 times she has not been able to get a visa in time, which I know is a personal issue for you, to get to meet the regulators in South Africa, in Nigeria, and Uganda, right? So I think for me, I see there's an issue for small businesses. Actually, they're not scaling, not because the technology is not able to cross borders, but because the people can't, and also because they don't understand how to do business. It's very easy to do business in one market in your home country, but then, and you think that you can apply that to quite frankly, setting up our business in Kenya, it was a totally different business model when we moved to Nigeria. So I think actually I know I'm kind of just turning this around from another side, but I think the issue is really not about, is it tech versus tech? I think it's just an issue of being able to scale businesses in general, to do business well and to do it beyond your home market.
Yeah. We don't have a lot of time left, but I've just noticed that all the questions have been from men, so we will only have female questions from please.
Hi, I'll try and be quick. My question is...
Could you hold it up closer? Sorry, thank you.
Hi, so I'll try and be quick with my question. So my question is regarding rapid technological development in Africa and how we can deal with the challenge of that development alongside infrastructural development. And now to clarify that, I'll just give a quick example. For instance, in my home country, we have 4G internet with optic fiber networks. but we're also still in the process of road construction around the country. Now, the unfortunate thing is because of the road construction, there tends to be interference with those optic fiber networks, which cause network problems with the national networks. So I wanted to know how we tackle those kind of challenges in developing economies.
Can you build roads and fiber at the same time? Or just put balloons in here.
I think that just is, my answer to that one is these are a lot of times the logistics between bureaucracies getting in the way with each other, and so you end up, one of them runs over the other one at some point, and I don't think that's a tech problem. I don't think it's I think it's just a organization and management problem.
Yeah.
Can I just
Please.
comment here on this? How many people here are from Nigeria? So,
Basically a Nigerian conference.
So, no, it's great. Did we bring Two-Face for this after party tonight? I mean, I think that, one of the things that I think we should be maybe more honest about ourselves, because we all know this in Africa, certainly in Nigeria. I mean, Nigeria, is there press here or not?
I don't know.
Is it being live streamed?
Yes.
Okay. So, some people might say, I would never say, but some people might say that Nigeria is a failed state. Can't supply security, can't supply power, can't supply road, can't supply medical care, can't supply education, can't supply water, right? Can't supply food. 6, 7 things that people need to
Pretty key
live.
things, yeah.
The entire government budget of Nigeria is less than 7% of GDP. I don't mean at the federal level, I mean at the entire budget of all levels of government is less than 7% of GDP. Almost 2% of that goes just to pay the salaries of senators and the top officials in the government. So there is really no government in Nigeria. So then you can ask yourself, why is it not a failed state? It's not a failed state because Nigerians, and I'm sure I know Nigeria best, obviously, because it's my home, and other countries do the same thing. Nigerians self-organize their lives in many, many ways. They self-organize security, so the markets, people don't pay their taxes, but if you're run a market, you're in a market, you pay your fees for that market. In fact, it's a quasi-tax, right? Because you've self-organized that way. You've self-organized in your power. So I have a client, banking client, who's committed to solar, putting solar panels on the entire bank, selling the power around the bank to people who don't have power in the neighborhood. Education, there's, I may have the numbers wrong, I understand there's something like 1,600 public schools in Lagos, there's 16,000 private schools in Lagos. So in area after area, Nigerians self-organize. So back to this issue of infrastructure, roads versus the internet, again, Nigerians self-organize to solve this problem the best they can. Now, I think we would be a little bit better off if we had a little bit more government capability on that to solve these problems. But until we get that government capability, the way these problems will be solved is solved by people, not by the state. So.
Yep. And I couldn't think of a better way to wrap up the panel. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I really enjoyed the discussion today. Clearly there's a lot of potential for technology in Africa. It's not just for startups to work with. Large corporates have a very big role to play. There's a very large pool of capital. It's a question of how we deploy it, as well as expanding that pool. I think we all have a role to play there as well. But I'd love everyone to please join me in thanking our panelists today.
So I just want to say this. You do not want to miss our final session of the day. So take an efficient coffee and tea break, but please be back in here.